Picture this at a fancy bank right in downtown Boston. A black man tries to make a simple withdrawal. The teller, though, she barely looks his way, just shoves his ID back at him, real sharp-like. Next thing you know, security's there, and they're hauling him out like he did something wrong, while other folks, white folks, are walking away with wads of cash, no problem at all. What that bank didn't get was they messed with the absolute wrong person. Oh, he was going to show them who was really in charge. So Daniel Walker walked into the Walker Trust Bank right at 9:05 a.m. The automatic doors swished open, and a bit of the cool city air followed him right in. Inside, the light was pouring through these huge, expansive windows, making these bright, shimmery patterns on the gleaming marble floors. The place had that steady buzz of activity. Employees in sharp suits hurrying behind the counters, customers waiting patiently, and that little customer chime going off now and then. It ran like clockwork, exactly how Daniel wanted it when he built the whole thing from scratch. But he wasn't there as the founder that day. No big meetings, no cameras, no major deals. He just needed to take out $12,000 from his checking account. It's something anyone should be able to do, right? No fuss. He wasn't wearing an expensive suit or some luxury watch. He just had on a neat, pale yellow shirt, some tan slacks, and decent casual loafers. He didn't stick out at all, just looked like any other person there that morning. As he moved a little deeper into the bank, he noticed this guy at one of the windows. An older white gentleman wearing a dark wool jacket. The teller was all smiles, counting out thick bundles of money and handing them right over. No questions asked. Daniel happened to see the amount on the slip when the man turned. $18,000. This customer just slipped the money into his pocket, gave a thankful nod, and walked right out. Nobody looked twice. Nobody bothered him. Daniel let out a slow breath. He felt his jaw clench up for a second. Then he made himself relax. He'd seen this kind of thing happen before. He'd felt it. But that day, he was more determined than ever to make sure his own bank wasn't letting that kind of quiet bias take root. He kept his face calm and headed for the tellers. The wait wasn't long. Pretty soon, he was at a counter with a red-haired woman in a crisp blue jacket. Her name tag said Emily Johnson. Now, she wasn't smiling, not like the teller with the other guy. She hardly even looked up at Ian before pulling a withdrawal form from under the counter and pushing it his way. "Fill this out," she said, her voice totally flat, like a robot. No hello, no nothing. Daniel looked at her for a beat, then down at the paper. Just a regular withdrawal slip. He didn't mind filling it out. Rules were rules after all, but her whole attitude just felt off. He stayed cool though, took a pen from his pocket and jotted down what was needed. When he was finished, he slid the withdrawal form and his state ID back to her. She picked up the slip, but didn't even bother with the ID. One look at the number he'd written, and she pushed the withdrawal form right back at him. "We can't do this," she stated, short and to the point, crossing her arms. Daniel felt a frown start, his hand just touching the rejected paper. "Excuse me?" Emily didn't even flinch. "We don't do large cash withdrawals like this." His forehead creased. "I just saw that man leave here with $18,000 in cash." He motioned toward the entrance, where the other customer was now on the busy street. "You didn't have any problem with him." Emily's mouth tightened into a hard line. "That's different." Daniel leaned in a bit, his voice steady but clear. "How exactly is it different?" For the first time, Emily looked away, but it didn't seem like she was embarrassed, more like annoyed. Instead of giving an answer, she just tilted her head a tiny bit, her eyes flicking over to that glass-enclosed office in the back. Susan Peterson, the manager, was in there, watching. And in that instant, Daniel knew what was going on. He followed Emily's glance to the glass-enclosed office. There was Susan Peterson, arms crossed, watching everything with this look that wasn't exactly hiding her judgment. She was a woman in her late 40s, in a perfectly fitted dress, and she had that sharp, knowing expression of someone who's already decided things before even hearing the story. The second their eyes met, she gave this tiny, almost invisible nod, but it was all the signal needed. Emily seemed to stand up straighter, her confidence suddenly boosted by her boss's silent "okay." When she looked back at Daniel, her eyes were even colder. She let out a sharp breath, like she was already tired of talking to him. "I said," she started, tapping the paper that was still between them, "we can't do this transaction." Daniel took a slow, careful breath, trying to hold on to his patience. "And I'm asking you, why not?" Emily didn't reply right away. She just tapped her polished fingernails on the counter. A slow, deliberate tap, 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 almost like she was trying to buy time. Finally, she let out a sigh and tilted her head. "It's just unusual," she said. And her voice had that fake sweet tone, the one people use when they're trying to sound like they're being fair. "A cash withdrawal this big? It's suspicious." So Daniel just let that word sit there for a moment. Suspicious. It felt heavy, It settled deep inside him, the way it always did when folks like Emily used nice-sounding words to cover up some pretty ugly feelings. He knew how this worked. He'd been dealing with it his whole life, trying to navigate these unspoken rules about who gets trusted right off the bat and who has to keep proving they even belong. "He didn't look suspicious when he did the very same thing," Daniel said. His voice was real steady, totally in control. He didn't even have to point. They both knew exactly who he was talking about. "So tell me, Emily, what's really the difference here?" Something quick flashed in her eyes. It was like she hesitated for just a split second, but then she got herself together and shook her head. "Sir, I don't write the policies." Daniel gave a quiet little laugh, but there was no humor in it. "You don't write the policies," he repeated, "but you sure seem to know how to bend them when you want to." Emily got all stiff at that. Her lips pressed together real tight. "I need to speak with my manager," she snapped, her voice suddenly sharp. And just like that, without waiting for him to say anything, she spun around and vanished into the back. Daniel didn't budge. His fingers just rested on the cool counter, tapping lightly, almost in time with his own heartbeat. You could feel the mood in the bank change. It was subtle, but it was there. Like the whole place could sense something was brewing. He could feel people looking. Other tellers were glancing over, and customers were kind of shuffling their feet like they knew something was up, but didn't want to get drawn in. A little ways off, a woman who was white and looked to be in her early 50s was watching him. She wasn't really hiding her curiosity. Karen Miller, according to the name tag on her handbag. She was near the information desk, her hands sort of clasped over the strap, like she was thinking about whether to jump in. Daniel met her eyes for a second, and she looked a bit unsure, then gave a small, hesitant kind of smile. He didn't smile back. It wasn't because he was mad at her specifically, but he knew this story. People like Karen, they watch, they whisper, they notice when stuff like this goes down, but they almost never step up. The door to that back office swung open again. Susan Peterson walked out. Her heels made a sharp click-clack on the marble floor, and her face was impossible to read. Emily was right behind her, chin up a bit, with that little smirk people get when they know they've got backup. Susan stopped right at the counter. She smoothed the front of her perfectly fitted dress and just looked Daniel over. "Good morning," she said. Her voice was all smooth and professional. It was the kind of tone they use when they're dealing with someone they think is going to be trouble. "I hear you're trying to get a large sum of cash today." Daniel looked her straight in the eye. "That's right." Her smile was polite, but it didn't have any warmth to it. "Well, unfortunately, we have some security measures for transactions this big." Daniel tilted his head a little. "Security measures?" "Yes," she said, smooth as silk. "To keep our customers and our staff safe, we need to be especially careful with large withdrawals." Daniel folded his arms, shifting his weight a bit. "So what does that mean for me exactly?" Susan put on this sympathetic look. It was the kind that's supposed to make you think she's sorry but really just feels like she's talking down to you. "It just means we have to check a few more things before we can go ahead." Daniel let out a breath through his nose. "You mean my things? Because it didn't look like you needed to check much when that other fellow took out more money than I'm asking for." Susan's smile didn't slip, but her jaw tightened just a little. That was a tiny sign she wasn't used to being questioned. "I can't discuss other clients' business," she said, her voice getting a bit harder. "But in your case, I'll need to confirm where these funds came from and check your last deposit." Daniel felt his patience fraying even more. "You've got my account number. It's all right there. Just look it up." Susan's face hardened. "I'm going to have to ask you to cooperate, Mr. Walker." Daniel laughed then, a short, disbelieving sound. "Cooperate? I'm standing right here giving you everything you need to do your job, and you're still trying to find ways to say no? That's not a security measure. That's profiling." The word just hung in the air, sharp like a slap. He saw it in the way Susan's eyes flickered, in the way Emily tensed up behind her. He saw it in the way the whole bank seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Susan's lips opened, then closed, like she was carefully choosing her next move. Then, still looking right at Daniel, she lifted one hand and made a quick, small gesture. Across the room, someone moved. Michael Davis, the bank's security guard. He was a big guy, white, and looked to be in his late 30s. He pushed himself off the wall he'd been leaning against near the entrance. His eyes went from Susan, then straight to Daniel. He didn't even pause. He just started walking towards the counter. Daniel didn't flinch as Michael Davis came closer, his heavy shoes echoing on the gleaming marble floors. The guard was tall and built solid. He was the kind of guy who wore his authority easily, like he didn't need a badge, because people like him are never questioned about whether they belong. His face was carefully blank, but his stance said it all. His shoulders were back, hands loose at his sides, and he walked with that slow, deliberate way people do when they're getting ready for trouble they know isn't necessary. Susan didn't even look his way. She didn't need to. The silent order had already been given. She just kept her eyes locked on Daniel, waiting, watching. She expected him to back down. They always do. Daniel let out a slow, steady breath. He worked to keep his face perfectly calm, even though something hot was burning up inside his chest. He'd seen this exact scene play out so many times before. It was an old story, a black man being treated like a danger in a place he was supposed to feel safe. "I'm going to ask you one more time," Susan Peterson said. Her voice was still polished, still perfectly professional, as if she wasn't the one making him leave. "Can you tell me where these funds came from?" Daniel's jaw got tighter. "My paycheck," he said, his voice even. "Just like every other deposit I've made into this account." Susan tilted her head just a bit. Her eyes flicked over to Emily Johnson, who was standing stiffly behind the counter with her arms crossed. "And can you give me the exact amount of your last deposit?" Daniel just stared at her. He could feel the whole room pressing in on him now. Other customers were trying hard to act like they weren't listening. The tellers were very obviously looking anywhere but at him. Karen Miller, that older white woman who had been standing near the information desk, shifted from foot to foot. Her grip on her handbag strap got tighter. You could tell she wanted to say something. He saw it in the way she fidgeted, the way her mouth opened just a tiny bit before she seemed to decide it wasn't her business. Daniel slowly dragged a hand down his face and breathed out through his nose. "You have my account number right there in front of you," he said. He was forcing his voice to stay level and calm. "Why don't you just look it up?" Susan's expression didn't even twitch. "That's not our procedure here." A low laugh with no humor in it at all escaped Daniel's lips. "That's funny," he said, "because I've been a customer here for years, and not one time has anyone ever asked me these questions. Not one time have I ever been made to feel like I don't belong here." He took a small step closer to the counter, and his voice got a little sharper. "So tell me, Susan, what is it about me that makes you think I don't?" Absolute silence. It was thick. You could almost choke on it. Emily's eyes darted toward Susan, looking unsure now. Even she seemed to know they'd gone past bank rules and into something else. But Susan Peterson? She didn't even blink. If anything, the little smile playing on her lips made it seem like she was enjoying the power she thought she had right then. Her eyes drifted past Daniel, a quick look that said more than any words could. Michael Davis, the guard, stopped right next to him. He was close enough that Daniel could feel him there, like a shadow just at the edge of his vision. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave," Michael said. His voice was flat, like he didn't care at all, as if Daniel was just some small problem, as if he wasn't a customer at the very bank he'd built himself. Daniel turned his head slowly and looked the guard right in the eyes for the first time. He held that look, searching for any sign that Michael understood, or doubted, or even hesitated. He found nothing. And still, he knew Michael Davis didn't really make this decision. Susan did, Emily did, all of them did. They had decided the moment he walked through those doors that he wasn't welcome, that he didn't deserve the same respect, the same trust, the same easy treatment the man before him got. The only difference between them was their skin, nothing more. And now they were kicking him out. Daniel took one deep breath in, then let it out. His patience was wearing very thin. He'd played this game long enough. He reached into his pocket, slow and careful, and pulled out his cell phone. He unlocked it with a quick tap, lifted it a bit, and hit the record button. "You're refusing to process my withdrawal," he said. His voice was calm, but loud enough for people to hear. "Even though I have my identification, my account information, and even though you processed an even bigger withdrawal for a white customer just before me." Emily tensed up. Susan's jaw twitched. Michael's stance got more rigid. "I'm going to ask you again," Michael said, but his voice wasn't quite as sure this time. "Step outside." Daniel's hand tightened around his cell phone. "And what if I don't?" Michael didn't wait. He reached out. A strong hand grabbed Daniel's forearm, His fingers squeezed just enough to make it clear this wasn't a request anymore. Daniel barely had a chance to get ready before he was pulled backwards. His shoulder slammed into Michael's solid body as the guard spun him towards the door, pushing him forward hard enough to make him stumble. A sharp gasp cut through the quiet. Someone muttered something. What in the world? But nobody did anything. His feet hardly got any grip before he was shoved again, harder this time, until his back slammed against the glass door. The hit sent a jolt up his spine, but Daniel didn't let it show. He wouldn't let them see it. The door flew open from the force, and the next thing he knew, he was standing outside. The cool city air felt like a slap in the face. Behind him, Michael stood in the doorway, arms crossed, looking down at him with a completely uninterested expression. And then, the last insult. His state ID, the very thing they wouldn't even look at, the very thing that proved who he was, got tossed onto the sidewalk at his feet. The little plastic ID hit the ground with a sharp, empty sound. Something burned in Daniel's chest. It was hot and raw, and dangerously close to tipping over from controlled anger into pure fury. But before he could even move, before he could reach down, a shadow fell over him. A second security guard, Kevin Jones, a black man in his late 30s, who looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with being overworked, stepped up. You couldn't read his expression, but there was something in his eyes when he bent down, when his fingers closed around the dropped ID. He dusted it off carefully, almost respectfully, before he handed it back to Daniel. This place, Kevin Jones muttered, keeping his voice low but just loud enough for Daniel Walker to hear. It always pulls this kind of stuff. Daniel took his state ID, his fingers just barely brushed against Kevin's, before the other man pulled his hand back. Kevin sighed and shook his head. It doesn't make a difference if you've got a college degree, if you have all the right papers, if you keep your nose clean and do everything by the book, he murmured. His voice was heavy, like he'd been quietly putting up with this for too many years. They just don't want us here. Not in the nice offices, not running things. We're security guards. We're the cleaning crew. We're just numbers they can use to make it look like they actually care. He glanced back at Michael Davis, the first guard. His face showed a mix of just giving up and trying to hold back his disgust. But this here, his voice dropped even lower, talking only to Daniel, this isn't anything new. Daniel stared at him for a long second. His heart was still racing, and he could feel the adrenaline pumping through him. Then slowly he reached back into his pocket. He pulled out his cell phone again. But this time he wasn't hitting record. He was making a call. The phone rang once, then twice. Then a sharp, clear voice answered. Robert Davis. Daniel's hand tightened on his phone. I need you at the Boston branch, right now. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Then he heard a quick intake of breath. I'll be there in 10 minutes. Daniel ended the call and slipped his cell phone back into his pocket. His fingers curled around his state ID, the edges pressed into his palm, helping him stay grounded, keeping the fury that was simmering just under his skin from boiling over. He looked over at Kevin Jones, who was still standing next to him. Kevin had his hands on his hips, his eyes going back and forth between Daniel and the glass doors where Michael Davis stood like a guard dog. Kevin Jones let out a short laugh that had no humor in it. Well, he mumbled, shaking his head again, this is about to get very interesting. Daniel didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The next 10 minutes felt like they dragged on for hours. Inside, through the glass, he could see the bank just carrying on like nothing at all had happened. Susan Peterson was back behind the counter, talking to Emily Johnson. Her movements were quick, efficient, and dismissive. Michael Davis stayed by the door, arms crossed, sometimes glancing over at Daniel but never holding his gaze for long. Karen Miller, the woman who'd been watching, had disappeared. She probably decided it was easier to just leave than to see something that made her uncomfortable. That was typical. Then finally it happened. A dark luxury sedan pulled up to the curb. The driver barely had time to shift into park before the door swung open and Robert Davis stepped out. Robert was the kind of man who got attention without even trying. He was white, maybe in his early 50s, with graying temples, a sharp suit, and even sharper eyes. Unlike the fake professionalism Daniel had dealt with inside, Robert's authority was the real deal. It was earned, not just put on. He didn't waste a single second. The moment he saw Daniel, his expression tightened. Then, he was moving. Michael Davis straightened up as Robert came closer. A flicker of uncertainty crossed the guard's face. He must have recognized him. He must have figured out this wasn't just some random customer. But Robert Davis didn't even look at the guard. He walked right past him. The whole feel of the bank seemed to shift as the glass doors opened for him. His presence cut through the tension like a knife. Daniel followed him, his steps calm and controlled, even though he felt a hot knot of anticipation tightening in his chest. Kevin Jones hesitated for only a moment before he trailed in behind them. The second Susan Peterson turned and saw Robert, her expression changed. It was somewhere between confusion and dawning realization. She stood up straight or smoothed the front of her perfectly fitted dress and quickly tried to compose herself. Emily Johnson, standing right behind her, went completely stiff. "Mr. Davis," Susan greeted him. Her voice was forced to sound even, her professional mask slipping back on. "I wasn't expecting you." Robert didn't let her finish. Clearly, his tone was cold and sharp, because if you had been, this situation wouldn't be happening. Susan's lips parted, then closed again. A hint of discomfort showed on her face, but she recovered fast. "Sir, there seems to have been some kind of misunderstanding." "Oh, there's no misunderstanding," Robert cut in smoothly. His eyes flicked to Daniel for a second before locking back onto her. "The only thing I don't understand is why my founder was just physically thrown out of his own bank." A dead silence filled the entire room. Emily Johnson turned visibly pale. Michael Davis stiffened by the door. Even the tellers who had been pretending not to listen froze right in the middle of what they were doing. Susan Peterson blinked, then she blinked again. For the very first time, her perfectly calm expression completely fell apart. Her mouth opened, but it was a second too late. "Save it," Robert said, his voice like steel. His gaze shifted to Emily. "You refused his transaction." Emily's throat moved as she swallowed hard. "I was just following procedure." "Procedure?" Robert repeated, and his tone was full of disbelief. Robert Davis let that word procedure just hang there in the quiet. He let it stretch out. "Is that what we're calling obvious racial profiling these days?" Emily Johnson's mouth opened and then closed. No words came out. Robert didn't bother waiting for one. His attention snapped right back to Susan Peterson. "Tell me, Susan," he said. His voice was slow, deliberate, and measured. "Did you even bother to check his account before you decided he wasn't good enough to get his own money?" Susan sucked in a sharp breath. Her composure was finally starting to crumble. "Sir, yes or no?" Robert's voice was quiet, but it had a deadly edge. Susan hesitated, but only for a tiny fraction of a second. It was more than enough. Robert Davis breathed out slowly through his nose, a long, calculated breath. Then he looked around the room. He looked at Emily, at Michael Davis, the guard, and at the other tellers who had just watched it all happen and said nothing. He let the silence stretch again. He let it press down on them with the weight of what had just been brought into the light. Then finally he spoke. "You're done here," he said. Susan Peterson went completely rigid. "Sir, effective immediately," Robert continued, as if she hadn't even spoken. "And if I find out this kind of treatment has been going on with other customers," his eyes flicked over to Michael Davis, "or if any employee working for me thinks they can use their job to push their own prejudices." He let the sentence hang there, unfinished. The threat was clear enough in the silence. "You won't just be out of a job. You'll face legal consequences." Michael Davis actually had the decency to look away. Susan's face turned a deep, blotchy red. It was a shocking contrast to the icy confidence she'd had just a few minutes before. "This is completely uncalled for." "Uncalled for?" Daniel Walker finally spoke. His voice was sharp with disbelief. "You had me thrown out of here like a common criminal. You wouldn't even look at my state ID. You refused to check your own system. You knew exactly what you were doing." Susan Peterson flinched. Robert turned back to Daniel then. His expression changed, and you could see a hint of apology in his eyes, even though he knew words couldn't undo what had happened. He gave a firm nod, then turned to Kevin Jones, the second guard. "And you?" Robert asked. Kevin stiffened. "Sir." Robert looked him over for a moment, then nodded slightly. "You're promoted, starting today." Kevin's eyes widened. He was clearly caught by surprise, and his posture shifted a bit. "You deserve much better than to work under people like this," Robert said simply. Then he turned back to Daniel. "Daniel Asharner," he said, and the familiar way he said his name was so different from the cold authority he'd used with Susan. "You want this branch sorted out?" Daniel Walker didn't hesitate for a second. "Completely." Robert Davis nodded once. Then, as if it was already decided, he turned back to the stunned bank employees. "Everyone who was involved in this incident will be reported for bias training. It's mandatory." His gaze stayed on Michael Davis for an extra moment. "That includes security staff." The heaviness of his words settled over the room like a final nail in a coffin. Susan Peterson opened her mouth again, but still no words came out. Daniel breathed out, slow and steady. Then, without even glancing at her again, he stepped forward. He reclaimed his spot at the counter. Emily Johnson moved aside immediately. Robert gestured towards the computer. Process his withdrawal. This time, nobody dared to argue. The crisp bundles of cash were counted out and placed neatly on the counter in front of Daniel. His money, his. It wasn't something to be argued about, not something he needed to justify. It was simply his. As he picked up the mish, his eyes flicked over to Kevin Jones. The man was still standing there, looking a bit dazed, like he was trying to take in everything that had just happened. Daniel slid one of the stacks of money towards him. Kevin frowned. "Sir?" Daniel held his gaze. "Take the day off." Kevin hesitated for a moment, then slowly reached out and took the cash, his fingers curling around the bills. Daniel turned then, meeting Susan Peterson's eyes one last time. "You should have checked my state ID," he said. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the bank. This time, no one dared to stop him.